Good morning. I'm Sarah. I was born in Ur the Chaldees to Terah. I have three brothers, half-brothers really. There's Haran, Abram, and Nahor. We're part of the Semitic clan because we were descended from Shem, son of Noah. In fact, we worship the God of Noah. We're also called Hebrews because we're descended from Eber. Ur was a huge, beautiful, cultured city of about 30,000 people. Ur was famous for its ziggurat, which was about 200 feet on a side at the base and rose in 3 tiers to the temple of Nanah, right at the very top, about 80 to 100 feet off the ground. It was mammoth. You could see it from miles away. But the people of Ur didn't worship just Nanah. They also worshiped gods of fertility and crops and fresh water. They had all kinds of gods. I still remember when grandfather Eber came to visit. Eber was 4 grades back as a grandfather. He was about 350 years old. In fact, grandfather Eber was grandfather Shem's great-grandson, and even Shem was still alive. Why, Shem was about 500 years old. That seems so ancient. No one around here lives that long. Grandfather Eber told wonderful stories he had heard from grandfather Shem. Why, do you realize that grandfather Shem was about 100 years old when the great flood covered the earth? Before the great flood, the earth didn't look like it does now. The mountains weren't as high or as rugged. There were no oceans, and the trees were absolutely huge. The earth produced an amazing quantity of amazing food with minimal effort. In the meantime, the people had become so wicked that God had no choice but to destroy them and start over with Noah and his family, including Shem. One time, Abram was talking to me, and he had a faraway look in his eyes. He said he was looking forward to a time when God would return and take his people back to heaven. There would be a city there that was even more beautiful than Ur. The city would have as its builder and architect God himself. The land would be even more beautiful than before the great flood. I was overwhelmed with the idea of such a place. One time I overheard grandfather Eber talking with father. He was encouraging him to leave Ur. He pointed out that just living among idolaters was affecting him. It's true. I can hardly believe it. But Father has recently built an altar to Nanah right here in our own courtyard. My brothers Nahor and Haran joined him in worshiping Nanah. But not Abram. Abram determined to remain true to the God of Noah. I admired his passion for God. Years passed, and brother Nahor married Milcah, who was brother Haran's daughter. Abram chose to marry me. My aim in life was to be a mother. I expected to get pregnant not long after I got married. But month after month passed, and then year after year, and no baby. I was filled with shame. What was wrong with me? Did I need to worship the fertility goddess after all? Abram was my rock. He told me not to be afraid, but to trust God, and God would provide. One night, God spoke to Abram. He said, leave your native land, leave your relatives, and come to a land I will show you. Abram went and talked to Father, and it was decided that our whole tribe would migrate. This included Father Terah, Abram, Nahor, and Lot, who was a son of Haran. Haran had died by this time. It also included all the women and children and, of course, our slaves. It was a huge undertaking to liquidate all our assets and purchase everything we needed for such a journey. I was apprehensive and fearful about this. After all, I was a cultured city girl, not an uncouth Bedouin. I'd be leaving the easy life for an arduous life, always on the go, with only a tent for a home. Once we got started on the journey, I quickly changed my mind. I realized how shallow life in the city was. On our trip, everything was organic. We'd pitch our tents and sleep on the sweet-smelling grasses. At nighttime, the stars were so bright, it looked like you could just reach out and touch them. By day, we could see God's handiwork. I love the slower pace and the contact with nature. Our trip initially started out on the plains that surround Ur. The trail grew more rugged, and the rocks turned into boulders as we headed northwest along the Euphrates River up to Sapur, and from there along the Tigris River on up to Haran, some 700 miles from Ur. The plains gradually changed to rolling hills, which became actual mountains. In fact, there was one place where the trail was only about 3 feet wide, with a chasm on one side and sheer cliffs on the other. I got off my donkey and walked in that area. As if that were not enough, it was scorching hot by day. The sandstorm scared our faces. The mosquitoes and sand fleas found all our exposed skin, and we had to watch out for snakes and scorpions. But we were following where God led, and that was enough. I learned that when I kept my eyes on God's promises, that everything went fine. But when I tried to make things work, they didn't. Finally, months after starting on our trip, we arrived in Haran. Haran was another cultured city that was dedicated to the worship of the moon god Nanna. Around Haran, they grew figs and grapes, olives and honey, wheat and barley. There was good pasture land surrounding the city, and it seemed like a good place to stop and let our flocks and herds rest and fatten up a bit. But before we knew it, we had settled in. The trip had been really hard on Father, and he didn't feel like he could go any farther. Was this the land that God was going to show us? Everywhere we stopped, Abram would build an altar to God Almighty. He would invite our family, our slaves, and even the neighboring people to come join us for family worship, where he would teach us about God. By day, I would teach the women about God as we spun the wool or cooked over the fires. Through this ministry, we had entire families join our camp. After our father died, God spoke once more to Abram. He said, "Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and I will make a great nation of you." Abram went and talked to Nahor, but Nahor had already kind of settled into the community, and he really wasn't up for another long trek. Those who went with us included Lot, our slaves, and the families who had turned from idolatry and now worshiped the true God. We were a large company that left Haran. Once again, we were on the trail, this time some 500 miles south into Canaan. It was difficult to travel. Canaan is hilly and wooded. The trails were narrow, and we were strung out over a large area. Sometimes we even had trouble finding a place large enough to camp at night. We first stopped in Shechem and stayed there for a while, and then we moved on to Bethel. It was a rainy season, but the rains didn't come. We kept anxiously watching the sky, but the sky remained brassy and cloudless. The pasture land was drying up, and Abram grew fearful. Finally, he decided we had to leave and go to Egypt to escape the drought and perhaps even outright famine. Looking back, I wonder why he didn't talk to God about it. After all, we were there in response to God's command. I've learned that when we're afraid and don't trust God, we make a mess of things. Egypt was one of those disasters. Abram had heard scary stories about the people of Egypt. He heard that if a man had a beautiful wife, why, the Egyptians had no qualms about killing the man and taking the woman for themselves. One night before we arrived in Egypt, Abram told me, when we get there, I want you to tell them that you're my sister, not my wife. He had it all figured out like this. By being my brother protector, the men would have to come to him to get me as a wife. And he could make the price so high that they'd just say, change my mind. I didn't know. I didn't like this idea. But in our culture, we have to obey our men. Besides, who was going to be interested in a 65-year-old barren woman? Boy, was I mistaken. My beauty was reported to Pharaoh's staff. And next thing I knew, I was in the king's harem. Now what? What about the promises of God? Next thing I knew, everyone in the palace was stricken with a disease. Everyone but me. I kind of figured it had something to do with me. Pharaoh soon figured that out too and called Abram out. He bitterly interrogated him about his motives in claiming I was his sister. Abram squirmed. He really didn't have a good answer. Now, Pharaoh had enriched Abram as a dowry for me with flocks of goats and sheep, herds of cattle and donkeys and camels, as well as many slaves. In the end, Pharaoh kicked us out of the country, but he let Abram keep all the stuff. Abram bragged about how he got all these animals and slaves. I was afraid the only thing he had learned from this experience was that he could get rich, claiming I was his sister. 10 years after arriving in Canaan, God spoke once more to Abram. He spoke to Abram, but Abram complained to God, Lord, sovereign Lord, what's the point of all your promises when I don't even have a son? My servant's going to inherit everything I own. God said, no, your servant will not be your heir. I'm going to give you a son who will inherit everything I'm going to give you. Then he told Abram to go outside. Abram got outside, and he said, now look up at the stars. Count them if you can. That's how many descendants you're going to have, without number. When Abram told me, I thought, now exactly how is this supposed to happen? We've been married for decades and don't have any children. Suddenly it hit me. God had never said it would be my child. I knew what I had to do. I had to sacrifice my pride, even my marriage. I had to find a concubine for Abram so God's promises would be fulfilled. Hagar was one of my favorite slaves. We'd gotten her from Pharaoh when we were in Egypt. One night I told Abram, God has kept me from having children. I want you to go into my servant, and perhaps I can have children through her. I tried hard not to let him see how much it hurt to suggest this, but I knew he needed a child. Looking back, I can see I didn't trust God. It was obvious I couldn't have a child. It looked like God needed help, and I was just trying to do my best to help God out. But it was all a big, bad mistake. Abram didn't protest. I'd hoped he would, at least a little bit. The matter was soon accomplished. And before long, Hagar announced to Abram that she was pregnant. All of a sudden, Hagar changed. She quit obeying me. She started saying she couldn't do this because she was pregnant. Finally, I lashed out at Abram and said, "This isn't working." And Abram lovingly put his arms around me and said, "She's still your slave. Do what you need to do." Perhaps I was harsher than I needed to be. But I needed to teach that girl a lesson. Hagar wasn't into lessons. She ran away. I have to admit, it was kind of nice having my rival gone. But Abram looked wretched. Here he had been counting on finally having a child, and now Hagar's gone. What a mess I had created. A few days later, I woke up and went out of my tent, and there was Hagar. What in the world? She already had water drawn and had food cooking. When she saw me, she came over and apologized for how she'd acted. Then she told me that she was on her way back to Egypt and had stopped at that well. You know, the one between Bered and Kadesh? She was resting in the shade there when all of a sudden the angel of the Lord appeared. The angel of the Lord, mind you. He called her by name and reminded her that she was my servant. Then he asked her where she was going. She recounted her woes, and then the angel told her that she was going to have a son, and she should name him Ishmael, which means God hears. That God would watch over her, but she must return and continue to serve me. What a story! I knew it must be true. There was no other explanation for her return and her improved attitude. In the course of time, Ishmael was born. Now, since Hagar was my slave, in a sense, Ishmael was mine also. In fact, I'd planned to adopt him when he was born. When the time came, I just couldn't do it. In fact, I could never even call that boy by his name. Ishmael, the Lord hears. Why would God hear Hagar and give her a son? I'd been praying for a son since I got married. It just didn't seem right. In the course of time, Ishmael was born. Abram was so delighted to finally be a father at the age of 86 years old. The whole camp celebrated the new heir. Ishmael grew through childhood. Abram loved being a father. Why, he'd take Ishmael out into the wilderness, show him where the water was, teach him which the edible plants were, show him how to track the animals, how to use a slingshot, in fact, use all the skills he needed to learn. But Ishmael had a troubled, restless disposition. When Ishmael was 13 and Abram 99, God spoke once more to Abram. It'd been a long time since God had spoken. God repeated his former promises and expanded on them. He told Abram he was changing his name to Abraham, which meant father of many nations. He said he was to call me Sarah, not Sarai, because I would be the mother of many nations and kings of people would come from me. Wow. That's the first time God had ever said it would be my child. Also the first time there was a time frame associated with it. When Abram told me about this, he said that he fell face down and laughed and said, Sarah is almost 90 years old. How in the world is she going to have a child now? And then he begged God that Ishmael would be the child of promise. God said, no, your wife Sarah is going to have a son about this time next year. But Abram didn't tell me. I don't know, maybe he was afraid that it wouldn't happen and I'd be disappointed once again. At that time, we were living near the Oaks of Mamre. And one day about noon, Abram looked out and saw some travelers coming down the road. He went to greet them and invited them to come rest in the shade of the trees. He washed their feet, had me make some bread, had one of the help kill the fattened calf. By the time it was done, it was quite a feast. While they were eating, I didn't want to be left out, but of course I couldn't be with them. So I went into my tent, and I was eavesdropping. One of the men said, where is Sarah, your wife? I was shocked. How did he know my name? Who were these people? Abram said, she's there in the tent. Then he said, I'm going to return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. I about exploded in laughter. I thought, how in the world is a worn-out old woman like me going to have a baby? Suddenly, the man was speaking again. He said, why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, how can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. It made my hair stand on end. Was this really the Lord? I was scared to death. I mumbled, I didn't laugh. And he said, that's not true. You did laugh. In the end, I had the last happy laugh because all he said came true. Right after this, we moved once again, this time to Gerar. Every time we moved, since we'd moved to Canaan, Abram had me tell people that I was his sister. Usually he got away with it, and no one was a wiser. Well, he hadn't learned anything from our Egyptian saga. And it happened again. King Abimelech had me taken into his palace even though I was 89 years old. I thought, oh no, here we go again. Once again, everyone in the palace got sick. One night, God spoke to Abimelech and said, you're a dead man. You have taken a man's wife for your own. Now, would not been together. So Abimelech said to God, will you kill an innocent man? They said they were brother and sister. God said, I know you're innocent. That's why I kept you from sinning against me. Now return her to her husband, and he will pray for you, for he's a prophet. Abimelech did return me to Abraham, and Abraham did pray, and his household was cured. I wonder if God was embarrassed to admit that Abraham was a prophet. God's word came true. I got pregnant. It was amazing. Who would ever have believed an old woman like me could have a baby? Why, girls who were young enough to be my great-granddaughters were giving me hints about my pregnancy. It was hilarious if you stopped to think about it. I enjoyed every little discomfort of my pregnancy and delivery. I had waited decades for these moments. I was not about to whine about a little pain. But there were two who did not share my joy. Hagar, and Ishmael. For 13 years, Ishmael had been considered the child of promise, and Hagar, his mother. Now they had to take a back seat. I regretted once again my fear and lack of trust in God. Little Isaac, what can I say? He was a perfect child. I'd never seen a more beautiful baby. Why, I loved to nurse him. I loved to hold him while he slept in my arms. I even loved it when he spit up all over me. I was living my dream. As Isaac was nearing his 3rd birthday, we planned a big party for his weaning. When a baby is weaned at 3 years old, he's considered a big boy. I could hardly believe my baby was already 3 years old. At the party, Isaac was running around having a good time when all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ishmael first teasing and then tormenting Isaac. I couldn't take it. I went to Abraham and said, "Throw that slave woman and her boy out right now. That boy is not going to share in the inheritance with my son Isaac if I have anything to do about it." Abraham was horrified at the idea of kicking out his beloved Ishmael. He went to his usual place of prayer, and God met him there. God said, "Don't be upset about the boy and your servant wife. Do what Sarah says, because from Isaac your descendants will be counted. But I will make a great nation out of Hagar's son too, since he is also your son." The next morning, Abraham got up, fixed some food and drink, gave it to Hagar and Ishmael, and sent them away. Abraham had to sacrifice his firstborn son to obey God. Isaac grew and became a man, a good man. One morning I got up, and both Abraham and Isaac were gone. One of the help told me they'd gone to offer sacrifice to God. Well, that was odd. Normally, Abraham told me before he took off on such trips. It was about a week later when they returned. There was something different about them. I could sense it, but really couldn't put my finger on it. What was it? That night, they came to my tent and told me the whole story. God had spoken to Abraham and told him to sacrifice Isaac as a burnt offering. Now, Abraham believed that Isaac was the promised child. He also believed that if he killed him, that God could resurrect him. But he didn't know how I might react. So he spared me and took off without telling me. They traveled for about 3 days, some 50 miles to Mount Moriah. There they built an altar to sacrifice. Abraham had to sacrifice this son also. But this was even harder because he was a promised, treasured son. But that's not all. He didn't have to just send him away. He had to actually kill him. They finished the altar, and Isaac climbed up on top. He encouraged his father that he could do this, and then he closed his eyes and waited for the end. Suddenly, they both heard a voice. "Abraham, Abraham, lay down your knife. Do not hurt the boy in any way, for now I can see that you truly fear God. You have not withheld even your beloved son from me." Abraham's eyes were opened, and he saw a ram caught in the thicket, the ram provided by God. They joyfully offered the ram as a sacrifice in place of Isaac. Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." Isaac. Can you imagine what he went through? He trusted his father and his God. And Abraham, he would really have killed our son. Wasn't he afraid that would be the end? He had trusted Isaac's life with God. I realized they had a deeper and more profound friendship with God than I did. They had encountered God in a personal way. And that was what I had perceived. Their lives were changed forever by this experience. As I listened to their story, I realized I want to trust God when I'm afraid. Trust God like they did. I want a personal encounter with God. I want to know God with such a deep and profound friendship that I can trust him no matter what comes my way. I want to be changed forever. What about you?
You pull out your connection card from the program, and on the back side of it, you read, "As I listened to this story, I realized I want to trust God when I'm afraid. I want a personal encounter with God. I want a deep and profound friendship that can trust God no matter what comes my way." If any or all of these are your desire, go ahead and check the box, and when the deacons come forward to pick up the offering, go ahead and put that in there.